Women have always been an integral part of history, although, when reading through the chronicles of the medieval world, you would be forgiven if you did not know it. From the introduction to Heroines of the Medieval World by Sharon Bennett Connolly. Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. From archers to archaeologists, we interview subject matter experts and content creators to learn why this figure continues to endure and consider what we can learn by examining what historian Maurice Keene called the matter of the Greenwood. If you've listened to the very first episode of this podcast, then you've gotten to hear my interview with Dr. James Wright, the buildings archaeologist. This summer, I was fortunate enough to be in Nottingham for the launch event for James's new book, Historic Building Myth-Busting. It's a great read, and a resource that I've made use of on multiple occasions the past few months, when topics relating to the purpose of spiral staircases in castles, or the supposed arrow-sharpening grooves on churches have come up in conversation. At least now you get a taste of what some of my conversations are like in my day-to-day life. The book launch was moderated by historian and author Sharon Bennett Connolly, who specializes in spotlighting the stories of women in the Middle Ages. Over the course of our discussion, we touch on the myriad types of roles women in the Middle Ages could have, and how it behooves us to broaden our notions of which of those roles we should consider to be heroic and what heroism even means. We also delve into historical scandals with discussions of secret marriages and allegations of witchcraft and adultery. And we do a bit of historic myth-busting of our own. Along the way, you'll hear mention of such notable women as Ethelfled, who you might be familiar with if you've ever watched Netflix's Last Kingdom, but also Marjorie Kemp, Joan of Arc, Eleanor of Castile, Hildegard von Bingen, and Sharon's personal favorite, Nicholaa de la Haye, and so many more. So string your bow, prepare to sift through centuries worth of one-sided accounts, and join me in the Greenwood with historian and author Sharon Bennett Connolly. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
It was really fortuitous getting to meet you at that talk that James gave at the beginning of the summer. And I've been reading and enjoying your book, Heroines of the Medieval World.
Oh, wonderful.
And like I said, one of the reasons why I wanted to invite you on is because that particular topic, that idea of notable women in the Middle Ages, and especially the stories of women and how they tend to get lost and get overlooked is something that I've been wanting to cover on the podcast. So the whole point of the podcast is taking this figure of Robin Hood and then thinking about how we can examine our world based on what we feel like we know because of that character. So what do we know about Robin Hood? Well, we know the character of Maid Marian. Well, how is Maid Marian portrayed? Well, in some stories, she's got a sword and she's out there fighting with the boys, and that's great. In some stories, she's a noble lady and very demure, and perhaps still very empowered in her own ways, though. But sometimes you also have stories where she's very passive. I don't know if you happen to be a Star Trek fan.
The original series, but I haven't carried on with all the spin-offs. But I did used to like the original series.
So there's an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, the one with Picard, played by Patrick Stewart, where the character Q turns all of the crew members into the Merry Men, turns Patrick Stewart into Robin Hood. with the idea that he needs to save this other character, Vash, this one recurring character and sort of love interest from the Sheriff of Nottingham, because he's trying to do Jean-Luc Picard a favor. And in his mind, in the mind of this omnipotent cosmic being, which is, of course, really the mind of the television producers and the writers, Maid Marian is this passive character who needs to be saved. And, you know, and then it's flaunting the tradition by having the character Vash not just settle for the role of the helpless damsel. So I feel we like intrinsically know that the helpless damsel trope is overused. And one of the things that I really liked about your book, Heroines of the Medieval World, is it takes that idea of heroines, notable women, women who we can think of as being heroic, but takes it in a lot of different directions. So I was thinking that maybe we could just start with that. So just to kind of go through the table of contents, you have women who are heroes because of how they fit within religious ideologies, women who are heroes because they were rulers in some way, women who were heroes because they were warriors, which are kind of the more traditional, what we tend to think of as heroic roles. But you also have women who are mired in scandal, women who were held captive, women who were disinherited, women who fulfilled, you know, what it was considered the medieval ideal as a proper wife or mother, women who were used as political pawns, and you still found ways to say, well, these are also heroes. And so I was wondering if you could start with that sort of thought process that led to those women who aren't the authority figures, whether it's leading armies like Ethelfled or having a lot of land and influence like Eleanor of Aquitaine, how some of these other women should still be considered heroes.
Well, that was the thing. The idea was to show that it wasn't what or who they were, it was what they did with who they were that made them heroes. And yes, I guess scandalous heroines and the medieval mistress doesn't automatically spring to mind as a hero. But I think every woman's life in history, if we know anything about it, it serves as an example of the fact that women weren't obscure. They did do things, you know, it wasn't that women weren't there. If you read history books from, say, 50 years ago, you'd think the only woman in medieval history was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and no other woman existed, and yet all these men were born, so the women must have been there, but they're not in the history books. They are in some of the chronicles, but not as much as the men are. And in actual history textbooks, they often get overlooked. It's that great man theory of history where everything is done by the men and the women sat at home sewing and raising children. And I wanted to show that women weren't like that, just like they're not like that today. And that we can look at what they did and find something heroic in all women's lives, you know, what they faced just bearing a child. You know, childbirth was more dangerous than warfare. And it was just an idea of just trying to put a wide spread of the different women that were out there to show that there were women who did things, who were noticeable and remarkable.
I did want to make sure we hit on that idea of that kind of the dangers of being a woman there. And we mentioned Ethelfled earlier. And one of the things I thought was really interesting that you touch on briefly in the book is how she had a child, but then didn't keep having children. How she did for years lead armies into battle, but wasn't having children. And that one could argue that that was the safer path. And there are many other women in the book who did die in childbirth. And some of them also had a lot of kids.
God, yes.
Yeah, I had to highlight one sentence in here because it was amusing in a very tragic sort of way. It relates to Marjorie Kemp, who took her religious views very, very seriously. Wasn't
Yeah,
exactly an aesthetic figure, but very
no.
devout in her own
And
way.
she probably annoyed a lot of people with all her crying, but she did have some good points.
Yeah, and the sentence was, it was only after 13 more children that she persuaded her husband in about 1413 to agree to a celibate marriage. You know, just 13
Yeah,
children, 13 additional children.
yeah. It's scary. The number of children, the number of times women were expected to give birth, and not all those children will have survived into adulthood either. There was a high
Right.
mortality rate in infants. So it wasn't just physical, it was also psychological, giving birth, watching your baby die if it was born alive in the first place. It was a very traumatic thing to have to go through
Yeah.
time and time and time and time again.
So I guess what I wanted to get to with that was just that acknowledgement of
Mm,
those sorts of hardships, but also a little bit of how much of there was this pressure on women to have children and how much they would have wanted it. Like the implication there is that Marjorie Kemp would have preferred a celibate life.
mm.
And we mentioned Ethelfled, who I don't know how celibate she may have been, but chose to at least stop trying to have children. But do we have a sense that they had either control or desire to have lots of children or try to have lots of children?
I think it was just seen as their duty. They were raised to this duty to carry on the family line. There was always this heritage and inheritance, and landed inheritance was the driving force for medieval families.
Mm-hmm.
If you gave birth to three daughters, then you had to carry on until you gave birth to a son, because the inheritance would go wholly to the oldest son. But if you only had daughters, then it would be split equally between the daughters and go to
Hmm.
their husbands rather than to them. But it would be split equally between the daughters. So if you only had daughters, like Eleanor of Castile did for a long time, then you had to keep going until you had a surviving son,
Right.
so that the inheritance could go wholly to that son. And also, I mean, with royal families, it wasn't just they needed a son and heir. They also needed daughters, because daughters could be married off for peace treaties. So,
Yeah.
like marry, if you're having an argument with Scotland, if you've got a daughter of eligible age, then you can marry her off to the Scottish king, and you might have a few years of peace. You might not, depending on which king you are, but you might have a few years of peace. So daughters were useful as well. But you don't find many families where they stopped at two or three children, because, of course, they didn't have any useful birth control. There were ways, and women tended to know the ways passed down from mother to daughter and through the wise women, but
Mm-hmm.
they weren't always effective. I've heard some of, what is it, dousing a sponge in vinegar and
Yeah.
putting it inside you to stop things and things like that. And the only actual way to prevent conception in those days was to not have sex, and that is very hard for people to not do.
Right. Especially if you have a husband who's insisting that they have certain, marital rights.
Yeah, well, they were also, I mean, the church told you if you were married, you were supposed to have sex to produce children, and as many children as you can. So it was just their way of life. You do see some men who go through three or four wives who've all died in childbirth, which must take its toll on them as well. Even if they didn't marry for love, it's still, seeing your wife die every 4 or 5 years can't be easy.
That was one of the things that caught me a little bit by surprise in the book was how often you had those cases of the husbands who might be on their third or fourth wife because the
Mm,
other ones had died or they had had the marriages annulled,
yeah,
but also the women who
yeah,
had three or four husbands because of husbands dying in battle or
yeah,
dying from illness, or because they had those marriages annulled or their fathers had their marriages annulled.
yeah. Or
There
you had
really
it,
was a lot of this back and forth.
And you had it a lot with princesses and noble heiresses who were married to older men. In order, because they were the eligible bachelors of the time who needed a wife, because they'd already lost 3 wives, so they needed a new wife, and they tended to go for the young nubile type. So you have these girls of late teens, mid to late teens, being married off to older men. So, and I suppose the consolation for the girls is, in 10 years' time, hopefully, he's going to pop his clogs, and your second husband might be someone who's you may actually get more choice in, because you're no longer as much under your father's will. So you have women like Joan of Acre, Edward I's daughter, who was married to Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, and who was much older than her. She was in her teens, he was in his 40s. And she had something like 5 children with him before he died. Then when he died, she married his squire, Ralph de Mortimer. And in order to not actually marry a squire, she sent Ralph to her father, Edward I, and had him knighted. Asked her dad to knight him for his service to Gilbert, so that she could marry a knight rather than a mere squire. And then secretly married him and upset Daddy.
He was not too pleased about that one.
No, imprisoned both of them, and then she had to. Then her children by Gilbert de Clare went begging to Edward I to release their mother.
Yeah, a lot of real complicated stuff going on with a lot of these families, and as you mentioned, a lot of very young women getting married off, and some of the things that we sometimes look askance at, like these tropes of the young women being married to much older men, you really were true, and often even just young children being betrothed or kind of promised or even married in a way when they're still really children.
Yeah, they could do that. I mean, they did. I think the main one I'm thinking of is Joan of the Tower and David II of Scotland. David II was something like, he was only a prince at the time, he was something like 5 years old when he married 8-year-old Joan. So they could do that, but there was a caveat, which was that they had to confirm the marriage when they became of marriageable age. For a girl, it was 12, for a boy, it was 14. They could disown the marriage once they were old enough to say they were married, but most of them didn't, because probably family pressures. It's the family that want the marriage, not the two people in the marriage. So it's like, and especially with David and Joan, it's a diplomatic marriage. So if you turn around if David turned around at the age of 14 and said, I don't want this marriage, it's like, well, that means war with England, doesn't it? I mean, they were already at war with England as it happens, but you don't really want to upset the diplomatic situation by renouncing a marriage that had already been agreed on by the families.
Yeah, I've had people kind of push back at times about this idea of women in particular being forced into marriages by their fathers. The idea that, like, oh, well, it was illegal for a marriage to happen if the woman actually objected. She still had to agree to it. Otherwise, the marriage ceremony wouldn't happen. So what kind of ability did a usually very young, to my mind, 12, 13, 14, these are kids in school. How much say could a young woman, even a slightly older one, who's still totally reliant on their parents
that's the thing.
For a living, how capable would they be of saying no? And do we have, I don't know, indications of it ever happening?
Yeah, they're not very capable, to be honest, because like you say, it's their father held the purse strings for starters. I suppose it depends on the parent. There was Edward III's daughter, Isabella of Woodstock, decided she didn't want to marry the man she'd been betrothed to, and she backed out of it, and Edward III got mad, but accepted it. So I suppose it depends how much the parents think about their daughters. Some would find it would probably force it to happen, but to be honest, most of the time, even with arranged marriages, the parents want the marriage to succeed. The whole aim is for the marriage to succeed.
Right.
If the bride and groom don't like each other, hate each other, then the marriage is not going to succeed. And even if it's a peace alliance between royals or just land alliance between nobles, they do think about their children when they're arranging the marriage. They think about what benefits it brings to the family, but also they have to be compatible, the two people involved. And I suppose you can't always guarantee that you're getting it right when they're children under 10, but by the time they're in their teens, you know what character they're going to be and whether or not they'll be compatible. You don't expect love. It's not about love stories.
Right.
If love comes along, then so much the better for the couple involved. But it's about them being able to get on and work as a partnership. And in most of the women I covered in Heroines of the Medieval World who were married, you see that. You see that they work in partnership with their husbands for the benefit of the family and the future, and, to pass everything on intact to their sons and get their daughters good marriages, because they are parents. They want to see their children happy, or at least content.
Right. Secure. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's in everybody's interest to make sure that the marriage is a good one.
Speaking of that idea of marriages and arranged marriages, now, pretty much kind of obviously, we don't know as much about women's lives as we know about men's lives, just because women's lives weren't written about as much. There's several times in the book you mentioned so-and-so enters the history when she's 20 or so, enters history when at the point she's getting married, like, because nobody thought to mention her before.
And when the husband dies, that's it, she disappears.
Right. So with the idea that we already have relatively limited glimpses at the noble women's lives, we must know so much less about the common women's lives, the people that aren't born to aristocracy. And so one of the common tropes that you hear repeated a lot in films is, oh, the poor can marry for love, why can't we? What do we have a sense of for the lives of poorer women, especially when it comes to marriages?
We know that they married later. They tended to marry in their early 20s rather than in their teens. I don't think love was any more involved with the lower classes as it was with the higher classes. It was about security and helping, marrying an appropriate spouse who was of similar or better social standing than yourself. You're looking to improve situations. Right. And it was about compatibility. If one family might marry their daughter to the miller because they grow corn and the miller mills corn. And but it would have been,
so it's kind of a micro scale of the same kind of political intriguing that you would have, just not with nations, but more local mercantile relationships.
I think the difference would have been that the couples would have had a better chance to get to know each other, because they probably grew up in the same village. Whereas with the royals and the nobles, it was more like their parents would have known each other from the royal court, and rather than the children getting to know each other. Although you do have instances where girls who are married young are sent to live, or betrothed young, are sent to live with their spouse's family as young girls or teenagers, to get to know the family and the domains she's going to be ladying it over before she actually marries.
Was that mostly just to aid that sense of, we want a good match for our daughter, so we're going to send her into the household so she gets a chance to know these people, just to enhance the likelihood of that compatibility?
Yeah, and I think it was also for her to get her as young as possible, so that she sees that her interests are with her married family rather than her birth family. The sooner they can get these girls into the family that they're going to marry into, they've got more investment in the family that they're going to be looking after, rather than in the family they were born into.
So we mentioned that idea of women having relatively little say, but there's still being a little bit of potential wiggle room, especially if they can basically convince their fathers. that it's not going to work out. Like, you know,
Yeah.
I'm not going to have this kid's babies, whatever. Like, figure out a different peace treaty, Dad. But that was probably pretty difficult and rare. One of the things that I found myself wondering is if there were ways of delaying as opposed to the outright refusals, because you get these things that come up sometimes in Robin Hood adaptations where Maid Marian's going to be married off to somebody, but she says, "Oh, I've sworn an oath not to marry until King Richard comes back from the Crusades," or, "Oh, you don't have the right to marry me off because I'm a ward of the king." Like,
Yeah.
how much validity is there to any of that kind of story?
There is validity of it. It doesn't always. I mean, there is, like, if she'd been married before and her husband had died, a woman wouldn't be expected to marry within the year after her husband's death. So she's got a little leeway there. You do get women who actually marry. I'm thinking of Alice de Lacy, who she was married to Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. He was executed after the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322. And she knew that the king would arrange another marriage for her. So she married a chap, Eubolo Lestrange,
Mm-hmm.
in order to avoid being forced to marry someone she didn't know. He was a knight, so he was a lower rank than her. But it meant that she and her lands were safe in his charge, and she'd had a choice and wasn't being forced into marrying somebody she didn't want. So you had that, in fact, that they'd go off and marry somebody else to avoid being forced to marry. Yeah, it was difficult for women. It really was. But there were ways. I mean, Eleanor, King John's daughter, Eleanor,
Mm.
after she'd married William Marshall's son, also called William Marshall, just to
There's
confuse everybody.
too many. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness, so many people having all the same names in the middle of
Oh, don't. I
it's
wrote Women of the Anarchy. There's 12 Matildas in the Anarchy period. It's like,
insane.
oh. But
Yeah.
yeah, so Eleanor had been married to William Marshall. He died, and she was still only a teenager, 16 or 17, at the time of his death. And you know what teenagers, girls are like. Lost love is the end of the world. So she rather rashly made an oath in front of the Archbishop of Canterbury that she was never going to marry again.
Yeah, that's the kind of oath that I was sort of wondering about.
Yeah, so she swore this oath that she was never going to marry again, probably pressured by her nurse companion, who she'd been with since she was a child, who also took the oath, this older woman. And it's like, well, you're an older woman, you're not a teenager.
You're also
So
not the former king's daughter, like how
yeah,
we
and
care
it was
less.
probably, as far as the King of England was concerned, her brother Henry III, it was handy because it meant that there would be no wrangling over the Marshall lands and her involvement in the Marshall lands. So, and she wouldn't have a husband to support her in her claims to the Marshall lands. So it worked out well for everyone all around, except for actually Eleanor, who had done it in her major grief and then met Simon de Montfort, who and fell in love and married him secretly, and then had to pay an awful lot of money for him to go to Rome to seek a permission from the Pope to marry her, because she'd sworn this oath
Because
that
she had
she'd never
sworn the
marry
oath.
again.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
there's a lot of, visiting the Pope and writing to the Pope to seek
oh
these
yes,
kind of permissions or to seek annulments.
yeah. I don't think we understand these days how much influence the papacy had on things like marriage and inheritance, and especially annulments. You couldn't get a divorce, full stop. Divorces didn't happen.
Yeah,
Annulments were the only thing you could get, which is a statement that you were never married in the first place.
right. That the marriage
And
was illegitimate for some reason.
yes,
The
and
consanguinity is one of my favorite
yeah,
reasons why.
consanguinity. You had to be, I mean, to be honest, from what I can tell, most marriages would break the consanguinity rule in medieval times,
Yeah.
because
So what is that rule for the audience?
you couldn't be married to someone who was related to you within 7 generations. 7 generations is an awful lot.
Especially for these noble families.
Yeah, exactly. They were all married to each other within 7 generations.
I suppose that gave everybody a very convenient out if they felt they needed one, though. So
Yeah,
I've actually wondered how much of that might have been purposeful. Well, we're not first cousins, so it's not that obvious. But if we
yeah,
need an out, since we don't have divorce, we can always claim consanguinity.
yeah. I think the thing is also it gave the papacy some control, because that meant that if you were marrying somebody who was related to you within 3 generations, you had to get papal permission.
Mm.
And the Pope would give the permission most of the time. So you you don't want to marry your first cousin. That didn't happen very often. But anything after that, you
Yeah,
could do it, but you had to get papal permission, which cost money, because
right.
everything from the papacy you had to pay for. So it was a good steady income for the papacy. They usually allowed it anyway. And you had to know your genealogy if you were going back 7 generations. There is an
Yeah, that's
example of,
complicated, especially because of all those marriages that we were
yeah,
talking about. Because not only is there a lot of intermarrying within the same few families, but like multiple intermarriages with for single individuals. Just like we were
yeah,
saying, you can have 3 or 4 marriages for some of these individuals and children with each of those marriages. So it can get really, really
it
complicated.
can. And then somebody throws a spanner in the works, because there's Isabel de Warren, who was the fourth Countess of Warren and Surrey in her own right, who'd been married to the son of King William. And when William died, Henry II's brother, also called William, just to help everybody,
Right, right.
wanted to marry Isabel. But they were forbidden to marry on grounds of consanguinity. But not because Isabel and William were related, but because William was a cousin of her first husband.
Right.
No blood relation to her husband at all, but because he'd been a cousin of her first husband,
Yeah.
Thomas Becket banned the marriage. And you have other instances. Henry I is a good one. Henry I of France. He decided he was so well related to most of the women in Western Europe that he needed to look farther afield for a wife. So he married Anna of Kiev, far away in Ukraine, because he knew that he wasn't related to her.
Right, right.
Although actually, if you think about it, he probably was, because she was descended from Norwegians. So he may have still been related.
Still might have been at least within that 7
Yeah.
easily. Yeah. Oh, that's crazy. There's a lot of characters in this book, and it's very dense. There's so many women, and that was one of the things that I also definitely wanted to hit on, was the impressive breadth of notable women figures in here who I had never heard of. And as somebody who I won't claim to be a historian by any measure, but I'm somebody who's always been interested in history and medieval history, and especially since starting the podcast, been looking more and more into the history of the late Middle Ages, especially from basically the time between Henry II and Edward III.
Yeah.
And so finding out about some of these incredible women who were alive during that time, like one of your personal favorites, Nicholaa de Haye, who you have written a whole book about.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa,
Yeah.
how have I missed this?
Yeah.
How is it that all of these women have totally slipped by me? And she is such a great example, especially as somebody who's a Robin Hood nerd, because
She'd
she's
have met Robin Hood. If Robin Hood was real,
right,
and I
because
think
she's
he
so
was,
connected to
she
Prince.
would have met him.
Yeah. So let's get a little bit into her, since I know she's a favorite of yours.
She
Who
is.
is Nicholaa de Haye, and why is she one of your favorites?
Well, I live about 40-minute drive from Lincoln. So when I first heard about her, it was just on a touristy visit to Lincoln Castle. And I was like, how have I never heard of this woman? She basically saved England. She defended Lincoln Castle in 1216 and 1217 against the English rebel barons after the Civil War with King John, and the French soldiers who'd come across with Prince Louis to try and claim the throne for Louis.
Right.
But nobody's ever heard of her. And I often say on Lincoln Facebook sites, and nobody's ever heard of Nicholaa de Haye, and they all go, oh no, she's famous, everybody's heard of her. And I'm like, you've heard of her because you're from Lincoln. Go outside of Lincoln and everybody will say, who's Nicholaa de Haye? And it's like, this woman I mean, she was in her 60s defending a castle in her own right. And she was the first woman in England to be made a sheriff in her own right. We had
Right.
had women who'd acted as sheriffs on behalf of their fathers and husbands, but no one had been appointed, as far as we can tell, to the job of sheriff like Nicholaa was by King John just
Yeah.
hours before he died. And it's like, this woman, she is incredible. She held on to Lincoln Castle long enough for Henry III's regent, William Marshall. He pops up a few times.
He does.
to muster an army and march to her aid and defeat the French and the English rebels in Lincoln.
Yeah. You know, I was reading that section of the book and thinking, what a fantastic movie this would be. And
it would be brilliant.
Like you said, she saves England a little bit kind of on John's behalf, despite England being in danger because of John being such a bad king. And so John is such a terrible king. This is after he has put his seal on Magna Carta, but he's tried to get it revoked. That was the first thing he tries to do. And so these English barons have invited the heir to the French throne to basically just come and become the new English king. They're like, this guy's terrible.
To be fair, Louis wasn't much better. The barons started leaving Louis's side because he decided to give the land he'd gained to his French friends,
right,
rather than his English allies. So Louis wasn't much better than John in the end.
Inviting somebody from over the sea to come take over your country may have not have been the best plan that they had. And so then John basically does two things that save England. One is appointing Nicholaa to Haye, sheriff, and saying, here, hold Lincoln.
Yeah.
And which she is able to do. And the second thing he does is die.
Yes, basically.
Because then Henry III, his young son, he's very young, but enough of the barons can be like, oh, well, John's out of the way. Maybe we can, maybe this kid won't be so bad. And as you say, Louis losing his supporters at this point too. And she's able to hold that castle. William Marshall's able to come to her aid. The two of them are able to kind of fight off Louis's forces. And so you have this interesting political dynamic that involves the death of a king and this young heir and this other prince. But then you also have this woman in her 60s defending this castle under siege. And who is coming to her aid but William Marshall, who gets appointed regent. And the guy who's rescuing to her aid is in his early 70s at this point.
I think that's the only reason it hasn't been made into a film. I think if he was in his 40s and Nicholaa was in his 30s, that film would have been done so many times. But you've got a 70-odd-year-old and a 60-odd-year-old, then...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I immediately started thinking of okay, so who am I casting? Judi Dench and Derek Jacobi maybe as William Marshall. I think that could be fun. So how come I've never heard of her before? Basically, not until I met you and not until I started reading your books.
I don't know. She's been overlooked, basically. She is in the record. We have a copy of the order making her sheriff. She actually gets named, one of the few women who is named in the chronicles. I think, to be fair, the best history we have of the period is the history of William Marshall. That was commissioned by his son. And although Nicholaa's in that, it's the story of William Marshall.
Right.
So I think the problem is all the chronicles that mention Nicholaa are commissioned by men, by the other men who were around Nicholaa. So nobody wants Nicholaa's story to outshine their own. So she gets, it's like, what was it in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves? They cut out some of the sheriff's bits because Alan Rickman was beginning to steal the show from Kevin Costner.
Oh, yeah, she still totally did.
It's the same with Nicholaa. She was beginning to steal the show from others. So it was like, we better cut that bit out. Okay, we can say she held the castle, but we'll leave it at that.
I was wondering if also some of it might be the association with John, because he's the one who kind of gave her the positions of power and he was so unpopular.
I don't think so, because she is mentioned, she and her husband are mentioned through John, and that was a tricky bit of writing her story, because I kept thinking, why was she so loyal to John when everybody else says John was so bad? I don't think it's as black and white as John was so bad. I think John's been hard done by the Chronicles, not as much as Nicholaa has, but I think he has been portrayed very black and white rather than the nuances and some of the things, because he had disagreements with the church chroniclers were never on his side. And it's the same with Nicholaa. Church chroniclers are not going to highlight the strengths of a woman.
Yeah, well, and that's sort of what I meant, because the chroniclers weren't on John's side, if they
Yeah.
might have also downplayed her enough.
But it's also because she was a woman. Church chroniclers tended to downplay anything women did anyway, because a woman standing out, holding her own and defending a castle was not womanly.
Yeah.
And one of them actually says that. She does things manfully. It wasn't what was expected of her. And it wasn't the done thing. You don't want to go persuading other girls to actually start defending castles and things. That's just not on.
And I think that gets a lot to one of the questions that I had submitted from the followers of the podcast on the Robin Hood Discord server. Wilhoff was asking about why misconceptions about women make their way into a lot of media. I mean, I think that more or less answers it. Would you agree? Like, just that women weren't written about. So
yeah, the thing is, the view of strong, independent women was frowned on. If a woman was strong and independent, then she was a she-wolf or haughty, as Empress Matilda was called, because they were expected to be submissive and obedient. That's how they were supposed to be raised, and that's how they were supposed to act as daughters and wives and even mothers. They were supposed to obey who the man in their life was, their father, their brother, their son, their husband. They weren't supposed to just go out and do things in their own way. You see criticisms of them as being haughty or overbearing. And it's like, actually, change the words around a little bit and say they were strong, independent, confident.
And I feel this is very in keeping with what we're still seeing today.
Yes.
And it was such a part of the news cycle in the US in 2016, and it has started all over again now in the news cycle for the US.
It's sad to see it, because it's just, we've come on so much since medieval times, and yet in some things we haven't. Because like you say, there's still this criticism of women wanting to be able to be on equal terms with men. The fact that you're looking at possibly having the first female president, and how long it has come to that, and it still might not happen. I mean, we've had a few female prime ministers, but even the female prime ministers we've had, they've wanted them to be more like men. Thinking of Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, they wanted her to act like a man. And she couldn't there were certain decisions she couldn't do because she didn't want to be seen as weak because she was a woman.
And I certainly was amused by the few times that there were compliments given to women who, like Ethelflaed or others, who did something that was considered successful and admirable, and the way that they were complimented was being said, oh, they acted like a man.
Yeah, exactly, because that's praise. Acting like a man is praise.
But
then you look at somebody like Joan of Arc, and
acting like a man got her in trouble.
Yeah, she was a hard one to write about, because there's so much discussion over mental illness with Joan, because she said she heard voices of saints. So everybody now says, well, she was mentally ill. So when I was writing her part, I was like, I tried to, whether she was mentally ill or hearing voices or hearing saints, what she achieved was absolutely incredible for a teenage girl in a time when girls weren't supposed to lead armies, weren't supposed to crown kings. And she galvanized France in its resistance to England. And it's like, all anyone can say, well, she must have been mentally ill. It's like, that's not the point. What she did is the point.
And she may have been mentally ill or not, but how incredible is it that
Yeah,
what she did, and then basically who knows what she could have done
yeah,
if she hadn't basically been caught on unfunctionally the wrong side of the lines,
yeah,
and then the king that she helped put in power left her
yeah.
out to dry,
Left her to her fate. And the fact that the English had actually thought so much of her that they had to destroy her.
Hmm.
Because they knew that she was the biggest enemy at the time.
Yeah, if Charles had actually stuck his neck out for her to save her from the English, if things had just gone a little bit different and she hadn't been captured, who knows
Yeah.
what the
But you
next
do
30
wonder,
years or something could have been.
yeah, exactly. And you do wonder if she'd been a man and a general, a traditional male general at the time, what would the French king have done to pay for her release?
Hmm.
But because she was a girl and there were these
And
question marks over her.
yeah, a girl, and not one of those noble families that had all
Yeah,
of those marital relations that you
yeah,
didn't want to worry
exactly.
about upsetting. It
She was
was,
somebody who was easily sacrificed because she didn't have the noble relations and the royal
mhm.
links that a general would have had.
Yeah, it's another reason why those marriage connections we mentioned earlier were very important.
Mm,
It's like, oh, we captured this person, this general, this knight, but also my cousin is married to
yeah,
their cousin. So I'm going to piss off my family if I don't
yeah.
release him on
Well, I can't
ransom.
kill him.
Yeah, exactly. So that it is, besides the initial kind of forming of treaties, it's also a little bit of a protection that
Mm,
people would have.
definitely.
And that's something she didn't, because
Yeah,
she wasn't from one of those noble families.
yeah.
Yeah, I wanted, speaking of attacks on women, just because this is so, again, relevant to what's happening right now. I was reading the section on Alice Perrers, the mistress of Edward III,
Oh, yes.
and she was being attacked by the chronicler of the Abbey of St. Albans, Thomas of Walsingham, and he's describing her as extremely ugly, saying that she ruled the king through her clever tongue. And these are like practically the same attacks that I'm hearing about Kamala Harris right now.
Yeah, yeah,
How we're going to, well, if this woman has gained a point, some form of influence or power, we need to denigrate it.
yeah,
There's a line of attack that the Republicans have about Kamala Harris sleeping her way into power.
yeah. I read that one.
And in the case of Alice Perrers, okay, she actually was the mistress of Edward III, but Kamala Harris is an elected official, but the attack lines are still the same.
Mm, yeah, exactly. It's always the same. It's like there's the other one is Catherine Swynford, who was the mistress of John of Gaunt,
Mm-hmm.
Edward III's son, and ended up marrying him. And it's like, oh, such a scandalous marriage. I mean, it was all right that he was having an affair with her for 20 years, but then to marry her and make her a duchess, that's just, it's just beyond the pale. And it's the same with Alice Perrers. Edward III had been loyal to his wife, Philippa of Hainault, throughout their marriage. She died and he was getting old
Mm-hmm.
and getting a tad senile, but she was his comfort
Right.
and she was there for him and she was there for him, not like all the advisors around him who were either trying to get an advantage from him or were waiting for him to die so that they could be with the next king, so that they could support the next king. And it was all maneuvering for position.
Right.
And the reason that they hated Alice was she was in that position. She had the king's ear. She could make or break someone. And
Mm-hmm.
they didn't like that. So they tried to bring her down. And unfortunately, Edward III died first. So they did manage to bring her down after Edward III died. Because
Yeah.
that's the other thing about a royal mistress. You're only good for the years that you're a royal mistress. When the royal dies, you have no defense and no supporters to help you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes that position really precarious.
Mm.
And yeah, yeah. Mistress, got to be really careful who you make friends with if you're going to be the
Yeah,
mistress, especially of an elderly king.
yes, definitely. I mean, Catherine Swynford was lucky because after John of Gaunt died, her stepson, Henry of Bolingbroke, had already become King of England. as
Hmm.
Henry IV. So she was protected because he'd known her all his life.
Yeah, she had been like his governess, more or less,
Yeah,
right?
she was the one constant in his life from the moment he was born, because his mum died when he was a year old. So she was the nearest mother figure that he could remember being there. So he actually called her my lady, the king's mother. He made sure that she was all right. But a lot of the times when you were a mistress, you didn't have that parachute.
Yeah, and I think she's a really good example of the kind of different ways that a woman could have a form of power and authority
Yes.
and protection, and how she was able to elevate her status through her relationship with John of Gaunt,
Mm.
get a position in his household, and then, as you mentioned, eventually married him. This very long, decades long relationship that they
Mm.
had then was able to kind of be legitimized. So it was through that kind of love and relationship with John, that John of Gaunt, that she was able to improve her life, become
Yeah.
a heroic figure in some ways, but then also through that stepmother role,
Yes.
and how motherhood
Yeah.
is also a form of power that needs to not be overlooked. And it's not just about who you marry, who you have romantic relationships with or sexual relationships with. It's also who you foster,
Yes. How
who
you
you're
raise
just
your
kind to, who
children.
you develop
Yeah.
personal relationships with. And she's a really good example of that because
Yes.
of the Henry IV situation.
Yeah, because you'd think that Henry IV would probably look at her and go, well, she's been having an affair with my dad for these 20 years, and I don't know, she's
Yeah.
been just gold digging, but she
It,
hadn't been gold digging. She'd been there, and she'd been there for John of Gaunt's children as well.
yeah, it defies the wicked stepmother trope too.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. But speaking also of other ways that women were attacked, I also wanted to bring up Eleanor of Cobham, who got
Mhm.
accused of witchcraft. And it seemed like it was what actually happened wasn't that she did any witchcraft, but was associated with people
Yes.
who did quote unquote witchcraft, and then became a little bit guilty by association.
Mm.
And this is another like big trope you see in movies, the idea of women getting accused of witchcraft.
Yeah.
So how common was that? And kind of what did it actually entail? What was this idea of witchcraft? And
It,
like I'm getting like horoscopes being read, like how serious
well,
and hard
that's
is
it. She was actually accused of predicting the king's death, because at the time she was married to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and he would have been king after Henry VI, before, because Henry VI was unmarried and childless at the time. So she would have become queen if Henry VI had died then. So she was accused of predicting the king's death, which of course is treason.
Mm-hmm.
So what she was actually doing, from what we can tell, is she was childless, and she was visiting a lady known as the Witch of Eye for potions to make her more fertile. But her husband's political opponents said that she was visiting the Witch of Eye for potions to poison the king. And there were these two other gentlemen who were casting horoscopes for her, which was where they came up with predicting the king's death. It is witchcraft. The accusation of witchcraft is one that you do see leveled against noble women and queens an awful lot. I think because the accusation is enough, it sticks.
Mm-hmm. And
And
it's so nebulous, you know?
yeah, there's no way you can prove it. So you can accuse them. So Joanna of Navarre, Henry IV's queen, was imprisoned for 2 years for witchcraft by Henry IV's successor, Henry V. The famous one, of course, is Elizabeth Woodville, who was accused of witchcraft, of bewitching Edward IV for him to get him to marry her by the Earl of Warwick. So it was, if there's ever a trope, accusing a woman of witchcraft to get her out of the way, happened an awful lot.
Yeah.
Especially if they were strong women who might actually get their way. So you can say, I mean, Henry VIII even accused Anne Boleyn of witchcraft, of bewitching him.
Mm-hmm.
It was one that you see it a lot more than you'd expect to.
And it seems like things that could otherwise just be innocuous and common things, like getting potions for maladies, potions for fertility, doing horoscopes. Those are common and accepted things, right?
Mm.
Basically, unless somebody wanted to make it become an
Yeah,
issue.
yeah, exactly. Everybody did it. It's just if you want to make a political accusation that sticks against a woman, bring up witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it, as a result of Eleanor's downfall, her husband was brought down as guilt by association because it was him she was looking at putting on the throne. So he ended up arrested and died in suspicious circumstances as well. She was imprisoned for the rest of her life, although they didn't make her walk barefoot in her underwear with a candle through the streets first in penance,
Right.
as you do.
Yeah. So it seems like with noble women, the trope of the burning at the stake less likely than some form of imprisonment, some form of
Well, in
penance.
medieval times, witches weren't burnt at the stake, they were hanged.
Right.
Burning at the stake was purely for heretics. It was in early modern times they started burning witches at the stake, but in medieval times it was a hanging. Burning at the stake in medieval times, it was for people like Joan of Arc who were heretics or recalcitrant priests and things like that. You know, it was people who were against the church.
Right. Joan of Arc was not
Not
accused of
witches.
witchcraft.
No.
She was accused basically of ungodliness because of
Yeah.
things like dressing in men's clothes.
Mm.
Um, but so were noble women able to get out of the hanging and do penances and prison,
Yeah, noble women.
basically have imprisonments instead?
Yeah, didn't tend to execute women an awful lot in medieval times, and they certainly didn't execute noble women. They were imprisoned for the rest of their life or for a suitable period. Like I said, Joanna of Navarre was for about 2 years in Leeds Castle. Eleanor Cobham was sent to Beaumaris Castle and
Mhm.
imprisoned there till she died.
Yeah.
So, and they had women to serve them while they were imprisoned. So it wasn't a cell, it was just they weren't free.
I've got a few more questions from the Discord, if you're good for those.
Yeah.
So Marianne asks, what role slash status slash profession that a woman might have was the most deceptively powerful? So these kind of noble women and the princesses and the queens are kind of obvious. But what is a role that women sometimes had that could be powerful, but we tend to overlook?
I think it's actually the role of the wife. In whatever circumstance she was in, from the king down to the lowliest villain, she was the one who could whisper in the king's ear at night after he'd had all the advice from his advisors. When he went to bed, it was the wife who was there talking to him. Same with the nobles. It was just, as a wife, she could, if she was clever enough, and most of them were, influence her husband's decisions on things. And as I think, just through the whole of history, a husband knows never to just ignore the wife. You know, that's not going to
Mm-hmm.
make for a happy marriage. So he's going to try and make sure that his wife's as happy as he is. And like I said earlier, a marriage was a partnership rather than anything else. The husband and the wife, their main aim is to continue the family line, to improve the family prospects, to gain land, wealth, and influence. So they're working together.
Mm-hmm.
In all of everything they do, they're working together. You don't find many instances of a wife working against her husband. I
Yeah.
can't think of one, in fact. You know,
Yeah,
they
that's a very good
work.
point.
It's a partnership. Even Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, although they fell out in the end,
Yeah.
and most of their married life, it was a partnership viewed at expanding the Plantagenet lands, making sure their sons and daughters married well.
I've got a question I mentioned from Will Hoff about where this kind of information gap is coming from. But he was also wanting to know what there is in medieval movies and media that you see them getting wrong the most. What is like the most common misconception that you see?
Women wielding swords. That never goes down well with me because women didn't wield swords. They would have loved to, I'm sure. but they knew their role. Women were very aware of their role in life, and even if they were giving orders, they didn't do it to men in front of other men. It would have been, they would have made sure that the orders were known. It wouldn't have been in public. Everything they did to gain for their influence would have been privately done with the husband before he goes out and talks to his soldiers. If she said, look, I think you should do this, defend, go out and attack rather than stay behind the walls. If that was her idea, then she would make sure that she told her husband before he did it, before he ordered his troops. She wouldn't stand there in front of everybody and disagree with her husband.
And even in the case of somebody like Nicholaa de la Haye, who's in charge of the defending the Lincoln Castle during the siege, she's not there on the battlements firing bows and throwing rocks, right?
No, she would have probably been on the battlements, just watching and making sure she was safe. And she'd also have to be aware that her being there puts other people in danger. So, because she would have been a target. So she'd make sure that she wasn't anywhere that would put her own men in danger of being attacked. So, but yeah, no, she wouldn't have fired a crossbow herself. She would have made sure there were plenty of men with crossbows on the walls.
Yeah.
And that was her job. She would have commanded where soldiers went and how they defended, but she would have also been well aware that they knew their job. They knew what they were going to do. And she did have a deputy, Geoffrey de Surland, because her husband had died in 1215, not 2015. He would have been old.
800 years or so. Yeah.
So she had a deputy in Geoffrey de Surland, who was an experienced commander himself. He'd commanded Wallingford Castle beforehand. So he could lead the troops and command the troops actually in battle. And she could make sure that all the supplies were in place, the soldiers were where they needed to be, and that they held out long enough for Marshall to get there.
Ben Curley from the Discord asks if you have a favorite misconception that keeps popping up.
Oh, I can't think of one. I'm sure there is. And I'm sure I'll think of it as soon as I get off here.
Do you have any examples of popular media that you would share that you think do an especially good job of portraying the lives of women in the Middle Ages?
Not really. They did well. It's like with Prince of Thieves and Maid Marian in that. She's way too outspoken. Although she would have been more outspoken than a peasant woman because she was a noble woman. To actually, that's one thing, yes, to actually be in the company of men on her own, that was a big no-no. Women had to be chaperoned. They couldn't just walk off with Robin and talk to him, and not if they weren't married. It's just not the done thing.
Yeah, and that whole idea of the chaperoning of women and that being able to feel secure in knowing the lineage of one's children, so you know that your wife wasn't spending unchaperoned time with other people, that's all really important.
It was very important. And you do hear a lot about, that is one thing that does wind me up, when women from medieval times are so blithely accused of adultery. Like you hear with Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife, where she's accused of having an affair with Edmund Beaufort, and it was her son, Edward, was Beaufort's son and not the king's. She would have made sure that he was the king's son because it was the most important thing to her. And the same with Cecily Neville and Richard, Duke of York, and Edward IV not being the Duke of York's son. And there was a TV programme about it trying to prove it. It was very one-sided, and it didn't actually look for evidence against that. But Cecily Neville would never have risked it.
Right.
But yeah, that accusing women of adultery so flippantly, I'm sure it did happen, but I don't think it happened as much as people think because they were so aware of bloodlines.
It seems like the accusation of witchcraft would be easier than the accusation of adultery.
Yeah. And that's perhaps why they used witchcraft as well, because if they couldn't accuse them of adultery because they were known to be loyal to their husbands and all the children looked alike, then you'd have to call them witches instead.
And you've got a line of people who can testify to them not being left alone with.
Yeah, exactly. They were always in company, especially noble women. They always had some ladies with them and girls who had been sent to their household to be trained to be ladies. It was an industry. You raised the next generation in other households so that they learnt manners and made connections that would aid them in it was their generation's turn.
To get away from the areas that are male dominated, is there anywhere to look besides nunneries?
Not really.
And,
That was the thing. If you wanted to get away from men, a nunnery was a good idea. But even then, nunneries themselves, women were not allowed to be priests.
right.
So they had to have a priest or a link with a monastery close by.
They wouldn't be doing their confessions to
No.
their prioress. They would have to have a male priest that was there for confessions.
Yeah.
And there would be a prioress who would have a lot of authority, but
Yes.
just over the priory, there would still be a bishop, right?
Yeah, they're still responsible to the bishop. So there would be the priory would have a prioress, the abbey would have an abbess, and they were noble women, and some of them were very influential women, and they were very well-educated women. It's the convents where girls were sent to be educated. And there's a great one in Hildegard of Bingen, who was an abbess in Germany.
She's gotten a little bit of a internet fame. She's gotten a little bit of notoriety.
Yeah, she has, and she was incredible. She was a very well-educated woman. She corresponded with popes. She wrote books, music, poetry. She knew all about medicines and herbs.
My partner's mother makes cookies following her recipes.
Yeah, she was incredible. She was definitely a polymath. She could turn her hand to anything. And yet she was sent to a nunnery when I think she was something like 8 years old. So she was never going to get married. But she was incredibly well educated, very independent. Although she was in a convent, she could decide more about what she was going to do than a wife would be able to. She was her own boss.
Yeah, but that's still just kind of within the confines of a small sphere.
Yeah, well, every woman had confines.
Right. So just kind of as a little bit of a point of clarification, mostly for myself, because I think this is one of the areas I end up getting kind of muddled and confused. What is the difference between an abbey and a priory?
A priory is, I don't know exactly. Priory is more junior than an abbey.
Okay.
So it was probably smaller. Certain monasteries, it was the Cluniacs. The great abbey at Cluny is the only abbey for the Cluniacs. Everything else is a priory. So it's a satellite of the abbey. The abbey is the centre main institution. And then the other buildings or communities associated with it are priories. So the prior answers to the abbey, and an abbey could have, like, the Cluniacs were everywhere, but there was only one abbey, and there were priories at Castleacre, at Lewes, and throughout England up to Scotland. So it was that the abbey was the main one, the big money earner, and the priories were subsidiaries of the abbey. So I did know.
There you go. I figured you had to. So I guess we never actually really did a proper introduction earlier, just in terms of your background and how you are a historian and kind of how you've gotten to be where you are.
It's been a bit of a long road, actually. I did history at school and at university, and then I went to work for a right Mickey Mouse company, Euro Disney. And Eurostar, the train that goes under the Channel Tunnel. I've worked there as well. But I also did volunteered at Conisbrough Castle, which is my local castle, giving guided tours. And I've always, whatever I've done, you should see my bookcase. It is just full of history, and I've always read history throughout. But then in 2014, my husband gave me a blog for Christmas because he didn't know what to give me, so he gave me a blog. And he'd set it all up for me. All I had to do was write the articles, which is brilliant because I'm not technically minded, but I can write articles. So I started writing history articles and noticed that the ones about women were more popular. So I carried on. I started focusing on women, which is funny because if you'd told 15-year-old me that I'd be writing women's history in 40 years' time, I'd go, no chance. But because I was a real Bernard Cornwell fan, I was into all the wars and the battles and Richard Sharp.
Yeah.
But I started looking into, because I thought women's history was raising children, sewing, all that kind of thing. If I'd known about Nicholaa de la Haye when I was 15, I would have been well into women's history from the very beginning because they did and achieved so much. So starting the blog, I started concentrating on women, found out all these medieval women who did such incredible things and just don't get a mention.
Yeah.
So I proposed, there was a competition with Amberley Publishing for people to get their first book written. And I sent in a proposal for Heroines of the Medieval World. And I didn't hear back for ages. And when I did hear back, I'm so glad I read the second line of the email, because the first line was, "Oh, Sharon, you entered this competition and I'm afraid you haven't won." And it's like, oh, great. However, we would like to publish your book anyway. So that's when it all started. It was like, I haven't won. Oh, I have. That's still going to publish.
How to be on a roller coaster in 2 sentences.
Yeah, exactly. So then it was like, okay, now I've got to write it. But that's where it started. And I'm now a fellow of the Royal Historical Society with 7 published books behind me and 1 coming out in January.
Fantastic.
Writing number 9.
Wow. What a journey. And I think that is hopefully going to change for, the 15-year-olds now, that
I hope
they
so.
have so much more access to history about women, and that they can feel inspired in the way that you weren't at that age.
I must say, it amazed me 2-3 years ago now. The Historical Association recommend my second book, Silk and the Sword, The Women of the Norman Conquest, to teachers to teach the Norman Conquest from the women's point of view. And I've been into a few schools now to talk about the Norman Conquest for the women. And it's like, and the teachers are absolutely loving it. And it was one thing I never expected when I wrote the book. And it's like, wow. So I'm hoping I'm helping shape young minds to consider women in history throughout their history journey at school. So
do you bring with you any kind of infographic to help them distinguish all of the different Matildas?
Oh yeah, I do a podcast PowerPoint so that they have all the images, so they don't have to look at me as well. Pictures are good.
So we've mentioned a really good handful, which is of course barely scraping the surface of all of the incredible, notable women that were around in the Middle Ages. Are there any others that we haven't mentioned before that you really think people will be doing themselves a great deal of service if they look up? Anybody else who you think is really, especially, you'd want to highlight?
Oh, there's so many of them.
Yeah, I realized kind of as I was saying it, that's sort of an unfair question.
Christine de Pizan is a personal favorite of mine. She's the first woman who ever made a living out of writing. So if it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't be here writing books. And she did it because her dad died, her husband died, and she was left with no income. But she was educated, so she started writing to earn a living.
If anybody wants to find your writing, where can they go to do that?
Well, my books are on Amazon. I do have a blog, as I said, historytheinterestingbits.com, and there are loads of articles on there. And I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, all the usual places.
Just with your name?
My name is Sharon Bennett Connolly.
All right. I'll make sure to include some links to your blog and to your social media in the episode description.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I like to ask people at the end of the interview, because Robin Hood is the initial launching point for these conversations, do you have a favorite adaptation of Robin Hood that could be coming from books, songs, TV, movies, any source?
Well, I'll have to mention two because they're both friends of mine. The books by Angus Donald and the ones
Hmm.
by Stephen A. Mackay.
Okay.
They're both very different versions of Robin Hood. And Stephen has him in Barnsdale Forest rather than Sherwood Forest. But they're great takes on the story.
Yeah, one of my very first interviews was with Stephen A. McKay.
He's lovely.
Well, yeah, great guy.
Yeah, and he does these short stories every Christmas as well, based
Yeah,
on Friar Tuck, Little John, and Will Scarlet,
I
and they're
love
more
those.
like detective stories. I keep
Hmm.
saying to him, you need to write a full-length detective story with these guys in it because they're brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's one of my favorite parts of his series, the Forest Lord series, are those extra bits
Yeah.
that gives it this kind of expanded universe feel.
Mm.
All of these short stories and novellas about some of the other characters.
Yeah, I think they're really good.
Yeah.
And they just add to the story rather than take away. And Angus Donald, he's actually writing a new Robin Hood story because he finished his series a little while ago.
Oh, I
But
didn't
he's
know you had
writing
a
a
new
new
one in the
one.
works. Yeah, that's great. Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your insights. I've really been enjoying the first one of your books that I've read. I look forward
Thank you.
to checking out more of them.
Yeah, there's a few now. I
Yeah,
was,
you've
I'm
been
always
very
amazed every time
productive.
somebody asks me to write another book. I'm like, really? Are you sure?
Well, and it's such a hallmark of how much there is to be said because there's so much that wasn't said in the past.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many to be covered, and that's the thing. My husband said to me, "Are you ever going to run out of something to write about?" And he's like, "No, because nobody's written about these women before, you know." So, and it's great now that there are so many authors turning to look at women in history
Yeah,
and
but there's still
showing.
centuries of lost ground there.
Yeah, there is, which is brilliant for me because I always have something to write about.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us here in the Greenwood.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, this was wonderful. And hopefully we'll cross paths again sometime.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Yep,
Possibly next to the major oak. You never know.
that would be lovely. Yeah,
Thanks very much, Thaddeus.
yeah, I'm
Been
so glad
great.
you were up for this.
I enjoyed it. It's nice to, because I don't get to cover heroines of the medieval world very often these days. So it's been nice to go back to it.
Yeah, I mean, I saw all of those books that you had on the table at James's book launch event.
Yeah.
And both knowing that, like, well, I was traveling and I only had what I could fit in my backpack, and also I've been unemployed for about a year. I was like, well, I can't buy all these books, so
Mm.
picked up just the one that looked like it was kind of the broadest.
It's
But
the one to start with, I think. It's my first one anyway. So they do get better written later on as I get more used to writing. But it's the one I think I'm most proud of because that's the one that took the guts to sit and write and put it out there
mm-hmm.
when I didn't know how people would receive it. And there weren't books about women in history
Yeah,
when it was released in 2017. There are a lot more authors now doing women's history books than there were then.
it's interesting to think about how much that has changed in really a
Mm.
relatively short period of time.
Yeah, there was nothing like it out then, but there are a few now. Philippa Gregory's done one, Nina Ramirez has done one.
Well, you were just such a good trendsetter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very informative book. I can't tell you how many times, my partner and I have been reading, and I keep interrupting her because there's some interesting tidbit that I found that I
Mm.
just want to share with her right away.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye, Thaddeus.
My thanks again to Sharon for not just helping to shine a spotlight on these amazing and often overlooked women from the Middle Ages, but also for championing that perspective that one didn't necessarily need to swing a sword or lead a nation in order to be considered heroic. A whole lot of heroic women from the past came up in our discussion, but we didn't even touch on some of my personal favorites, like the infamous Isabella of France, or Black Agnes of Dunbar, about whom the Earl of Salisbury supposedly wrote, after he repeatedly failed to seize Dunbar Castle from her in 1338. She makes a stir in tower and trench, that brawling, boisterous Scottish wench. Came I early, came I late, I found Agnes at the gate. There's a whole lot more amazing women to learn about and exciting details to delve into. And a great place to start is with the books of Sharon Connolly or her blog, History, The Interesting Bits. Check the episode description for a link. Are there any overlooked women from history that you think deserve more attention? Or details about the realities of women's lives that you think need to be highlighted more? Please get in touch and let us know. You can find Into the Greenwood on most of the major social media platforms, including Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. We're currently still on the site formerly known as Twitter, but it really is turning more and more into a wasteland. And if you're wary of social media in all its forms, you can also reach out directly via email with the address intogreenwood@gmail.com. There is also an active Discord server for all things Robin Hood related, run by friend of the show, Mike Nichols. If you'd like to join that Discord community where we source questions, organize watch parties, play games, have a book club, and just generally engage in friendly discussion, then reach out over email or social media to get an invitation. Into the Greenwood is supported by our amazing and generous followers on Patreon. A merry and stalwart band that includes Jen Sylvia, Murphy Mason, Janine Tolos-Hennig, Alan W. Wright, Jeff Massey, Theodore Papke, Seth, Roger Papke, and Emily Holt. At patreon.com/intogreenwood, you can follow for absolutely free or contribute as little as $1 a month to help pay for our hosting fees. Patrons at the Merry Bandit and Notorious Outlaw levels also get bonus content that can include extended interview segments and other special exclusives. If you're willing to make even just a small one-time contribution towards keeping Into the Greenwood on the air, we also have an account on buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood. Anything at all would be greatly appreciated. And since this whole project is inspired by a forest hero who has become associated with charitable work, no matter how much or how little is contributed to keeping this podcast running, a minimum of 10% of all proceeds will be donated to a select charity. At this time, that charity remains Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated organization dedicated to establishing sustainable access to food and clean water for impoverished communities around the world. If you're feeling a bit impoverished yourself, a positive rating or review, or just sharing a favorite episode or two, would do wonders for helping others to find the show. As a small, independent podcast amid thousands of options out there, it's a real challenge for our little show to break through and gain listeners. So every single rating or share makes a significant impact. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing safe travels to you, one and all, until our next journey together into the Greenwood.